There we go. I did
Yeah.
promise that to everybody. So this will be recorded for later viewing. Welcome everybody to this webinar today. We've got people strolling in and we've got a critical mass here to start going. So good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to this fall webinar sponsored by TSHS. Again, that is the Teaching Statistics in Health Sciences section of the American Statistical Association. You can see on Zoom, my name is Tom Braun, and I'm a professor of biostatistics at the University of Michigan here in the United States, and I'm currently the chair of the TSHS webinar series. If you are not a member of our section, a number of you answered my survey saying you didn't know or maybe know, please consider joining us. We host a number of activities throughout the year, including these webinars, and we work really hard to build a community of statistics educators who work primarily in health sciences settings. We also host the TSHS Research Resources Portal, and it's at the website listed on the screen here in front of you. So if you're looking for real world data to use in your courses, please head over there. And for more information on our section specifically, please check out the section blog that we have, as well as our section's website, both of which have links listed on the screen here. Regarding the webinar today, we'll have Dr. Philip Sedgwick make his presentation, and we'll save plenty of time at the end for questions and discussion. So all attendees are muted during this presentation. If you do have questions, and we really hope you do, please put them in the Q&A feature of Zoom. By hitting the Q&A button on your screen. Please don't use the chat. I have both windows open and I'm going to do my best to navigate ideas that you have and questions you have for Dr. Sedgwick, but please use the Q&A feature as much as possible so that I can get to your questions and organize them appropriately. So please, Q&A, not the chat. So formally today, TSHS welcomes Dr. Philip Sedgwick. He is a reader in medical statistics and medical education at St. George's at the University of London. He has 35 years of experience in research and teaching. And during those years, he's written and co-authored nearly 150 peer-refereed journal publications and book chapters in the areas of clinical research, epidemiology, and medical education. He's taught a variety of specialties in the health sciences at both the undergraduate and the postgraduate level. His teaching includes disciplines of medical statistics, research methods, critical appraisal skills, and statistical computing. The focus of his teaching is delivering teaching that is practice-based so as to enable students to see direct application. In 2018, Dr. Sedgwick was awarded the Best Contributed Presentation at JSM among the presentations sponsored by TSHS for his talk, Statistical Significance, Time to Look Forward. And he received this award again, most recently in 2021, for his talk at the most recent JSM, from which today's webinar is based. So with that, Philip, the screen is all of yours, and okay. Welcome.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Tom. I cannot start sharing. Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay, until you stop sharing, right?
There you go.
One of the faux pas that I often make, and let me just. Okay, I'm hoping that everyone can now sort of see my slides, and I just need to go back to the start slide, and hopefully that when I get into this mode, whoops. Okay, I'm hoping that everyone can now see my slides, and I'm in full screen mode, so I'm very much dependent on Tom to, if you have any comments as we go through this, my talk tonight, I'm more than happy to answer them as we go through. But obviously, there's a challenge in getting them into the Q&A, and actually Tom sort of interrupting at the strategic points. Now, thank you very much indeed, Tom, for the introduction. Apologies, Tom, but I'm also going to add probably what I think is one of my sort of big points in my career was in 2009, I was asked to write weekly for the BMJ on a series called Statistical Endgames, which sort of total over 300 publications around sort of statistics, sort of research methods, and it also invoked and included communication skills and then on a few occasions research ethics as well. So that's probably one of the highlights of my career. So I thought I ought to sort of plug that a bit. And as Thomas said, well, in 2021, earlier this year in August, I was really sort of stoked to have won the best contributed sort of presentation in the sort of section on teaching statistics in the health sciences. And it was the second time I won it, and I was really stoked, and I just really couldn't believe I won it when I won it the first time, let alone the second. So I'm really sort of very honored and very sort of in a way flattered that people thought so highly of my talk then, and hopefully perhaps we can carry on some good ideas tonight. The title of my talk is Trials and Tribulations of Teaching Null Hypothesis Significance Testing in the Health Sciences. Now, this is obviously a topic that's evoked, particularly hypothesis testing has evoked a lot of debate recently in the last sort of 10 years, but it hasn't been just confined to the last 10 years. I think I ought to just add that my primary responsibilities teaching at St. George's are to, in the undergraduates, are to on the graduate entry program. So we have basically graduates, and you know, they have to have done a degree before they can study medicine at George's. So some of those will have already studied statistics before they get to see me. And I do a lot of teaching on the postgraduates particularly in the healthcare sciences and biomedical sciences as well. Now, some aims of my talk tonight, it is really very generic. I just want to sort of share some of my experiences and approaches to teaching hypothesis testing and consider some of the challenges when learning. So I'm actually trying to put myself in the student's shoes here and when I'm teaching it as well, and outline some of the discussions more recently, I suppose, about using hypothesis testing in research and consider the responsibilities of the research communities, and including journal editors, researchers, and teachers in terms of the use of null hypothesis significance testing. Now, okay, I suppose, you know, there has been sort of an awful lot of discussion about the teaching of statistics in the health sciences, and I suppose what we would call non-specialists. I don't really know a better phrase at this stage. And some of the challenges that, you know, people raise have included, well, for some students it's not their intentions to come to university. For some of them, some of my students are very surprised that they actually have to learn, you know, statistics at the undergraduate level on the undergraduate MBBS degree, although they are graduates when they get to us. And for some of them, you know, they have different abilities in terms of their mathematical and statistical skills, and that can actually, for some students, generate an awful lot of anxiety. And I think that idea of that anxiety before they even get to me can actually sort of present a barrier in terms of their learning. So I think, you know, there has been this shift in curriculum design to actually thinking about real world application. And I think that's very generic, you know, wherever we're teaching, whichever country. And that's around that's sort of a focus on statistical thinking over and above calculations, formally, and sort of theory, and actually just putting them on the back burner. But I want to think tonight about, what are the implications of that? Are there any negative implications? And I think there really is. This shift to statistical thinking has, for a lot of students, I think, led to a lack of awareness of the principles of statistics, which you might think are very much sort of theoretical based, and I'm going to touch on that tonight. And I think they fail to apply statistics and make inferences appropriately at times. Now, I do appreciate all of these sort of challenges that we're facing in teaching are coupled with limited curriculum time. I get just 10 hours with my undergraduate MBBS students to try and teach them everything I know about statistics, which is really quite challenging. And so therefore, you know, I have to be quite practically minded in thinking about getting through the curriculum, but also trying to sort of give them enough, I suppose, indication about what the statistics is based on. And that can actually be, I suppose, what some people consider be wasted time. Now, I think one of the sort of biggest challenges that a lot of us face around in teaching is teaching null hypothesis significance testing. And it's created a lot of debate in itself as to whether we should be using it. But obviously it needs no introduction. The null and the alternative hypotheses with a p-value, critical level of significance of 5%. But the debate that's intensified, particularly in the last 10 years, is around the misinterpretation of the p-value. And I could give you numerous examples of misinterpretation that students sometimes feed me. For example, it's probability, we'd have got the data by chance, and that's the one that really sort of winds me up, because I really don't know what that means. Confusion around inference, statistical versus contextual significance, but so whatever, despite all of this debate, p less than 0.05 has become the cornerstone of decision making. It underpins, in effect, everything we do in society. And I really don't know why. And I can't help but think that some of this shift to statistical thinking, real world application, has led to some of these challenges that we're now experiencing. And in particular, I think sort of in a way, the teaching around hypothesis testing, which I sort of often see in textbooks, is a very mechanistic like approach. It's like a recipe. You collect your data, you do your test. Is the p-value less than 0.05, yes or no? And then you make your decisions based on that. Now, I sort of think that perhaps in order to overcome some of these challenges, and in particular, I'm just going to, apologize, just turn my pointer to a laser pointer, so that will help me in presentation. I think sort of some of the challenges that we have, particularly around the confusion around the inferences that we can make on p-values, we need to sort of think of solutions here, and then we need to overcome them. I think if we're going to overcome and sort of start getting our students to use statistical hypothesis testing sensibly. And obviously I appreciate that there is a big drive to get rid of it, and I will come back to that in a minute, but we need to reflect upon our teaching. Some people will say that teaching null hypothesis significance testing, particularly in introductory courses, which someone said to me like course 101, and there's sort of this sort of common phraseology, it's just really just too difficult because it encourages this dichotomous thinking. And that was Hack in 2014. I think that was at ICOTS. I think it was, I don't remember which one of the ICOTS conferences it was. Now, I would challenge that because I say, well, you know, it does encourage dichotomous thinking if that's what you get your students to, you know, to think. So responsibility does lie with you as a teacher. But I would agree, these concepts are abstract, they're not simple and intuitive, and, you know, sampling distributions, that really is, they're based on probability. But probability is really a very difficult concept, and many people don't find probability easy. You know, there's no reason why our students should. I mean, hopefully most mathematicians and statisticians find it an easier, relatively easy concept, but just try and put yourself in the student's shoes. And then what is really bizarre, and this threw me throughout the whole of my undergraduate degree, and it took me some while to sort it out, even whilst I was a lecturer, that you have a single test statistic which you base on your data from your sample, a single data set, that's a single set of data, and then you make inferences on it based on probabilities through the p-value. And probabilities are based on long-term averages, or for example, I suppose populations. And I could never make that connection. It really was bizarre. It was surreal to me. And I think also students struggle with the concept of statistical inference. Well, not just students, actually, you know, a lot of clinicians I work with as well, the concept of statistical inference versus truth of hypotheses. And you must remember, sample data provide evidence, not truth. And I think people struggle with the idea that statistical hypotheses are never proven or accepted. And that really is a challenging idea, I think, because that doesn't sit sort of philosophically very well with what I think people are trying to achieve in research. And I think it's no wonder, is it? We've got this dichotomous thinking with bright line rules and absolute thinking approach. And is it not surprising that statistical significance is always inferred as being contextually significant? Now, that's something I want to challenge tonight, actually, and sort of think about how we sort of overcome that in our teaching. Now, I want to share some of my approaches to learning and teaching, because I think all of this does sort of stretch back to when I was a student. And I don't want to sort of say how many years ago that was, because that just shows how old I am. But I want to talk about some of the personal struggles I had as a student and as a teacher as well, when I was trying to encourage statistical thinking. And when I started teaching this, I did really sort of, I think I basically should be ashamed of myself, because I presented misinterpretations and I encouraged this dichotomous thinking, which everyone now is sort of basically saying should be stopped. And so what I'm now doing is turning the tables, because I am shifting back to underlying principles and the theory of statistics, and actually sort of saying, I think you need to introduce that and actually sort of come back from this idea that everything has to be real world and everything has to be sort of like statistical thinking approach. But I do this in a very sort of visual way, because I think you need to, in this aspect, accommodate the visual learner. Now, to do this, I can use any example, but typically I'd focus on a clinical trial, because I think that's much easier. So I use a standard one, double-blind placebo-controlled superiority RCT. And I know some of you are now saying placebo-controlled, you shouldn't be having it. Well, I mean, because they're unethical, but you know, this is published in 2018, and I do think by using an example of a placebo-controlled trial, it does allow me to talk about the ethics of placebos and our current thinking about sort of where they sit within, I suppose, their use in clinical trials. And I think it's probably okay here anyway. The researchers wanted to investigate the effectiveness of fish oil supplementation in pregnancy. And one of their outcomes, has been included BMI at age 6 years in the offspring, in the children. So they're wanting to sort of like see the long-term effects. Massive study, it's a massive sort of length of follow-up, but it's a really useful study, I think, to illustrate this. And the intervention, 263 individuals, placebo, 260, relatively sort of big RCT. Now, this is Gilbert, and probably some of you are wondering what has Gilbert got to do with it? You know, I find one of the biggest challenges to students understanding hypothesis testing is they have no idea of the underlying principles of statistics. And all of the textbooks I recommend don't even approach it. They don't even come close to it. So I feel as if I have to do this. And, you know, so what's Gilbert got to do with it? Well, statistics is actually based on this concept of having an infinite population and repeated sampling from the population. So let's just say let's just consider repeating this study that I've just introduced, the RCT. We repeat it ad infinitum under the same conditions. Now, because we're taking random samples from the population, and each of those samples are going to consist of different individuals, different expectant mothers, we're going to come up with, different sample estimates, and in particular, I suppose, the difference between the intervention and the placebo group in the outcome measure, i.e. BMI, in the children aged 6 years. Now, each of these arrows here represents a different sample estimate. And in particular, the bullseye is the population parameter. Now, the bullseye, in terms of the population parameter, I think sometimes people use different terminology for this, but it's, you know, if I could include everyone in the population and push them through this trial, the population parameter would be the thing that I'm trying to estimate, the exact, I suppose, value that we want to know, which is the difference between intervention and control in the outcome. Now, obviously, some of these samples are going to lie very close to the bullseye, some are going to be very far away, but you're never going to know that because you only ever do one study, and in particular, you don't even know what the bullseye is. And what this is really useful, because I think this automatically says to students, right, that, okay, we do use a single sample to estimate the population, but statistics is based on this idea of basically uncertainty, and we need to be accepted, we need to embrace it. And this is a very useful introduction as well to when you're teaching confidence intervals, not just hypothesis testing. I try and get students to sort of appreciate this idea throughout the whole course. And this is one of the slides I showed them on day one. But once you've introduced Gilbert and this idea of uncertainty, it's not that difficult to start introducing the idea of probability distributions. Now, we might want to compare the intervention and the control groups, for example, you know, in the outcome, for example, using a t-test. I'm not saying you would, but there's no reason why you shouldn't. Now, each of these samples is going to give a different t-test statistic. And if we plotted those infinite number, we would end up with a histogram looking like this, i.e. your probability distribution. Centered around 0. Obviously, it has to be because you've got a two-sided alternative. And obviously, a difference of 0 between the two groups represents equipoise, and the alternative hypothesis could be intervention less or greater, less effectiveness compared to control, or it could be greater than your control group in effectiveness. Now, I then tell students that in order for us to get our single p-value for our study, we reference our test statistic, our single test statistic, or the computer will reference this for us against this distribution. Now, let's just say my test statistic was 1.5. I've just taken the absolute value. That's the easiest way to explain it. And if I then sort of draw a line here, right, I'm interested in the percentage area bounded to the right of this test statistic bounded by the curve. And let's just say, for example, it's 25%. Probably that's an overestimate. And then obviously we're interested on the left-hand side, on the negative side of that scale as well. And we just add those two together, and that's our p-value. Well, obviously, if our test statistic falls within that rid region, which is the critical region, i.e. if it's basically great, if the absolute value is greater than plus 1.96, and I obviously appreciate this is approximate sort of distribution, then you're going to get statistical significance, and your p-value is going to be less than 0.05. Okay, it's going to be less than 5%. Now, I must admit, this stage, when I introduce this, particularly in my postgraduates, who many of them have had a bit of teaching before in statistics, the penny finally drops and they realize that statistical significance is only the extreme 5% of samples under the null hypothesis. There's nothing magical about it. But you see, and up to this stage, none of my students will have had this type of introduction. They just get told statistical significance, contextual importance, and they're thinking, how, why, tell me how, I want to know what's under the bonnet. And yet when they see this, very simple, I think it's a very visual approach, they begin to get the idea of what statistical significance means. But the question is, what does that threshold, 5%, why is it meaningful? And then we start talking about contextual significance. And I sort of say, well, it's the observed effect that we've seen in our study important contextually. Now, that is often an end user expert's decision. And I think that's really, really difficult for students. And a lot of the time when we talk about statistics and sort of confidence intervals in particular, we say, is this important contextually? Students are going to really struggle with that because they haven't got a clue. I mean, I don't have a clue either. But I think that's where you need the experts to come in. So I would tell students that in all of this context, in terms of statistical significance, you require context, not a simple threshold. Now, I would appreciate, and I don't necessarily teach students at this stage. I do my postgraduates, but not those on the undergraduate MBBS degree. There's obviously importance in clinical trials here, because obviously when you're calculating sample size, because we can use contextual significance through the smallest effect of clinical interest to drive statistical significance if it exists in a population with a certain power. So therefore, I suppose this idea of thinking about contextual significance over and above statistical significance, which is something I'm quite keen on, we don't always have to sort of adhere to that, because we can use contextual significance to drive statistical significance in trials. Now, I always think that in anything I teach, it's always good to give a historical perspective on this. And I do teach students this because they need to know why are we in the state that we are today in terms of hypothesis testing. And there's a lot written in the literature, and obviously the ASA have two big statements on it as well. So our students are going to be reading this, and I think they need to have a bit of a historical perspective. Now, obviously it was Fisher who in 1925 advocated null hypothesis and the p-value, and he said the p-value was the strength of the evidence through your data supporting the null hypothesis. He did suggest 5%, but he said it's not absolute, it's very much subjective up to the researcher. So it may be such that if you've got 5%, so p-value sort of less than 0.05, it may be a marker or some indication. Look at your data. Sorry, excuse me. Is there something important there? Actually, but don't think of p-value less than 0.05 as absolute. But a few years later, Name and Pearson came along and they said, well, if you have a null hypothesis, you can't have a null hypothesis without an alternative, and you should really set your type 1 and type 2 error rates in advance. They didn't necessarily say that type 1 should be set at 5%, but they were just advocating that idea. And then somehow, and I have absolutely no idea how null hypothesis significance testing was born, but it was a combination of these two theories. And you have your p-value and your critical level of significance of 5%. And we sort of start thinking of rejection or failure to reject the null hypothesis based on what is some people call an arbitrary division based on statistics. And it is a statistical concept. And we've ended up by saying significant and non-significant. And that was never the intention of Fisher and Name and Pearson. And I really don't know what they would think of that today. But it wasn't really too long before eminent statisticians were sort of saying, what's happening here, because the abuse of null hypothesis significance testing was taking place 70 years ago. It's not a new thing. And Yates commented on it, and he said the emphasis on tests of significance and the consideration of the results of each experiment in isolation have had the unfortunate consequence that scientific workers, and I love that, scientific workers, he doesn't say scientists, I just love this sort of, I suppose, to me it's sort of, I suppose, very sort of antiquated approach to talking. I've often regarded the execution of a test of significance on an experiment as the ultimate objective. No, nothing has changed in the last 70 years. And why is that? That's a really big question. Why haven't we changed? We've seen it, okay, out and about, published in the Journal of the American Statistical Association. What's happened? Now, I think it's really important with my students to develop a culture of uncertainty. I tell them data is evidence and nothing more. And it's the p-value is the strength of the evidence in support of the null hypothesis. Now, I'm going to be really sticking my neck out on the line here, and I don't know how some people might feel about this. I never say that these hypotheses are true or false. And in fact, if students start saying they are true or false, I pick them up on it. And I really sort of take them to town. And I say, well, you can't say they're true or false because hypothesis testing is based on this idea of sampling from a population. And in particular, I don't think it hurts to remind them of this little ditty, from Altman and Bland about sort of 25 years ago, which said absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So basically, just because you don't find any evidence to reject your null hypothesis, that's not evidence that basically, I always have to get this right, but it's not evidence that there is no difference. Okay, so it's this thinking about sort of, in essence, I could do a study today and get a completely different result to someone who does the same study tomorrow, but that doesn't make me right and someone else wrong. I thought there was a gap in the market here for a little bit of a ditty of my own in terms of the other side of it, but it doesn't ring, it's not so, it doesn't trip off the tongue so well. Evidence of difference is not an evidence of no difference. It's a little bit of a double negative, but I thought I'd try and claim it, at least for myself. Now, the one thing I will also never, ever sort of let my students get away with is saying that results from hypothesis testing are positive or negative. Because I think those words have connotations, and in particular, the word positive is something that we want. And I don't see why we would necessarily strive for statistical significance and see that as the end result. And it does put a lot of weight on statistically significant findings and gives them sort of more credence or, I suppose, weight in terms of the idea of looking for evidence. So I don't let them get away with that. But the one thing I find really difficult is developing this culture of uncertainty, is that there's a difficulty in healthcare, in particular with clinicians, because they will often see, and I think it's true what Banerjee and Al have said, is that a statistically significant p-value is seen as the end of the search for truth. So once you get a statistically significant result, I have proven that a drug works or whatever. And I think that's really sort of that idea of that basically we can prove something in using through a hypothesis testing completely misunderstands what hypothesis testing and statistics is about. So I feel that for a lot of the research community, there is really a lack of understanding of what statistics can achieve. I also do introduce students to basically more so, I think, sort of some of the sort of activity over the last 10 years. And we're all aware of what's happened in basic and applied social psychology. And it started off, I think it started off in about a little bit before 2014, but in 2014, Trafimo published an editorial where he discouraged the use of hypothesis testing. He said it was invalid, and in particular, I think his ideas of invalid were based on this idea. It said, we believe that the p less than 0.05 bar is too easy to pass, sometimes serves as an excuse for lower quality research. They said no authors are no longer required to undertake it. But the effect was apparently none. It was a suggestion, it was a recommendation. Nothing happens. So, sort of, I suppose they got a little bit fed up with this. I don't know what they were thinking. And later in 2015, Trafimo and Marx published an editorial where they basically were banning it. P-values, statistic statements, significant confidence intervals, everything are gone. You're not allowed to even mention the word significance anymore, whatever context it means. And they said, well, the emphasis on this is now going to be on descriptive statistics graphs. And I'm pretty sure they meant absolute effect sizes, not standardized ones there. Now, to me, I thought at the time they were throwing the baby out with the bathwater for a little bit, because I think p-values, hypothesis testing might have some sort of use, particularly in the context of driving sample sizes in clinical trials. But I would agree with this emphasis. And I always say to students, no, if you're not going to look at your data, I describe it, get graphs, etc., and so on. Why did you even bother to collect it if you're not going to actually look at it? If you're going to go straight for p-values, then I feel as if that you're not being very sort of responsible or even ethical in your research. Now, moving on, I also do let them know, I also sort of try and get them to read these type of articles as well, that's sort of published in Nature, where sort of there were more than sort of apparently 800 signatories who had sort of signed up for this about statistics reform and banding and statistical significance. Now, I do sort of somehow feel that sort of getting 800 signatories, and I don't know if any of those 800 are in the audience tonight, I feel it's like sort of ganging up a little bit. I'm not so sure we need it. But they just said, let's just abandon the idea of statistical significance on this sort of arbitrary categorization, and that's fine. Because they've said that it's led to hype claims and dismissal of possibly crucial effects. And I would completely agree with that through, I suppose, the overabundance of type 1 errors that are going to just exist in the literature. But they said, we're not banning p-values, confidence intervals or statistical measures, but what we want you to do is discuss evidence provided and estimates and accuracy, magnitude of effects, okay, which is, I think, is absolutely fine. And I think, this is a bit more of a sort of level playing field, sort of more sensible approach, I think, to the situation compared to the journal of basic and applied social psychology that just throw everything out. Now, I also appreciate, and I will come back to this, that the ASA have had two very, very important statements on this as well in 2016 and 19, but I'll come back to that in a minute. But I think it's very useful for students to actually be aware of what's happening in the research community. Don't hide them from this, okay? Just encourage them to read it, right? Some of these articles may not agree with everything that you want them to believe, well, I say believe, but actually to sort of take on board as students, but you've got to encourage them to read the literature and make informed decisions themselves and actually get engaged in this discussion. Now, what is interesting is there has been a bit of an opposition to this sort of retiring statistical significance, because I can never pronounce this gentleman's name, Ioannis. Retiring statistical significance would give bias a free pass, and he said post hoc and subjective statistical inference is susceptible to conflicts of interest. So that's right. Obviously, looking and making some comments around ISOs, the sort of magnitude of the effects after you collected the data is going to be subset. It's going to be sort of prone to bias, possibly, or conflicts of interest. A company could, for example, claim that any results somehow support licensing of its product. Yeah, that's true. It's going to happen. But you've now got this tension between arbitrary decision making based on the p-value less than 0.05 and potential false claims. And I wonder how much of the literature is false claims based on type 1 errors, and subjectivity based on expertise and potential biases. You've got this sort of bizarre tension that I feel that some people are arguing, and I'm not really too sure where I sit on the side of this, but I feel as if I'm always going to come down to sort of favouring subjectivity based on expertise, and sort of still possibly having some potential biases there. Now, what I want to sort of move on to is sort of trying to sort of think, why is it in the research community we can't get change? And in particular, obviously, now students are going to be part of that sort of community in the future, and there's barriers to change. And journals, I think, are your editors, and your journals, I should say your editors are your gatekeepers here to this. And I really do think that they discourage sensible interpretation. Sometimes they only let you discuss statistically significant results, and I just tear my hair out at that. Had a massive battle with the British Medical Journal over a few years when I was writing for them over sort of that period of 6 or 7 years. They would never let me write statistically significant, and I would write these articles, send them in, and then the editor would come back and say, this is what we're going to publish. And I said, well, why did you cross out statistically significant? Because to me, there are 3 types of significance: statistical, clinical, and what's important to the patient. And they say, yeah, well, we don't care. That's our house style. And I could never get around to that. And it was either I give up, stop writing for them, or I try and, I suppose, work with them and perhaps sort of, I suppose, help educate. But I never got very far with it. And I think this really has massive connotations in how not only the research community, clinicians, and even the public make inferences on published research, because they can access that now online. And I think the inference is, as soon as you drop the word statistically, I think it has this inference that somehow the intervention works, the drug works, or bacon's a risk factor for colon cancer. Yet, you and I know that the drug doesn't work in everyone. It works in perhaps majority of people, well, sometimes a majority of people. And you and I know that, some people eat bacon and they don't get colon cancer, and some people get colon cancer and they don't even eat bacon. And I feel as if that this sort of somehow dropping the word statistically significant has an impact upon the inferences we make, and then particularly the inferences we make, whether they be at the population or the individual level. Now, I sometimes wonder why researchers don't actually have more of a kickback against this, but at the end of the day, they're thinking of career development. They just want to publish, lengthen their CV. And I'm being very cynical here. If they don't lengthen their CV, they're just going to perish. All right, so that's that concept of, you've got to exist in your institution, you've got to publish and lengthen your CV and look good. So they don't really, I think a lot of researchers have gone above this idea of really sort of, does it really matter about statistical significance? It's just what gets me published. Now, moving on a little bit here, I think another barrier to change is these are the things that really annoy me at the moment, and claims to knowledge and erosion of good practice. Now, claims to knowledge, I think, rests entirely for me in this idea of non-expert teachers. And in particular, I suppose I'm having to be careful what I say here, but people with no sort of qualification. And I have come across people who teach statistics who've just picked up a textbook and they think they're an expert. Now, Amy Swab McCoy, I think she did an excellent presentation at JSM 2018 in Vancouver, and this was around basically doing a review of the people who teach statistics, if I remember rightly, about statistics at her institution, which I think is it Creighton University in Nebraska. I don't know if Amy's in the audience tonight, but I think it's really sort of potentially very sort of dangerous because they have a lack of understanding of the discipline. In particular, it took me sort of good 20 years to understand hypothesis testing, I think. And I think, what happens is, they will just basically repeat what they got taught. And so what they learn, they teach, and end up in this vicious cycle. And I suppose in effect, it's what Cobb sort of indicated in our 2014 forum. We teach it because it's what we do, and we do it because it's what we teach. So we're in this vicious cycle. So really, I suppose, I feel that sometimes with non-expert teachers, they encourage this sort of idea that we just can, and which we cannot get out of. And perhaps it's not sort of surprising. We've been in this vicious cycle for 70 years. I will be sort of honest here. I have plenty of non-expert teachers at my institution. I don't know why I have clinical pharmacologists who are effectively clinicians or biomedical scientists who have no qualification in the subject. They got taught it in their undergraduate degree and they think that they can deliver it now as well. But at the same time, I mean, I'll be totally honest with you, some of the expert teachers at my institution do not know, and I suppose I want to say an expert or correct interpretation of a p-value. They don't know it themselves. So there's a challenge here that I think we've all got to work together somehow. Erosion of good practice, this I see happens an awful lot, so particularly at the postgraduate level where I'm sort of, they're going to have to start doing some sort of hypothesis testing themselves. Home truth here is, I hope, I believe I deliver good practice in my lectures, and I hope I'm not sort of being too sort of arrogant there. But what happens is they go out of my lecture with these sort of ideas around good practice, see their research supervisor, and they say, and this happens a lot in the biomedical sciences, and they say, yeah, forget about what Sedgwick told you, because no one listens to that. All right. What the key thing is, get a p-value less than 0.05. You can publish, and if you don't publish, you will perish. Right? And that is very, very evident at I think in my postgraduate students. And it's very much sort of, I think, more so this idea of p-values of, in the biomedical sciences, there's a sort of, for me, there's a sector that really is sort of not wanting to listen very much to what perhaps is happening into the healthcare sort of area of sort of research. And quite often, for my biomedical science students, they will, the head of the lab will be their supervisor, and basically they say, if you don't do what we tell you to do, you're out. So there's a little bit of a drive there, and in terms of, in order to survive, I'm only going to ever be interested in statistical significance. Some of the challenges, sort of some further comments here, some of the challenges that I really have about this, and when I'm teaching any aspect of statistics, it's not really just solely about hypothesis testing. But how much do students really need to know in order to achieve their learning objectives? And some people have said to me, what I'm teaching, some of the slides I've shown you tonight, it's far too complex. These ideas are far too complex. Just go back, teach it in a mechanistic way, and sort of say, get p-value less than 0.05, and you get statistical significance. But I think students still need to ask this question. They still need to know, what does statistical significance, what does a p-value actually mean? And then I just tell them it's a mathematical concept. But what you need to do is be able to understand that mathematical concept in order to inform any decisions about contextual importance. And what's really interesting, I think, in order my colleagues about who say don't teach them what p-values actually are, is, I think the ASA statement in 2019, moving to a well, sorry, excuse me, moving to a well beyond p less than 0.05 is actually quite sort of important. They basically said statistically significant, don't say it and don't use it. And I suspect that's going to have a massive impact. Maybe not, it's 2 years on, I don't know. It doesn't seem to have had too much impact, but obviously I think the ASA are going to keep driving that. So in future sort of years, I mean, what are students going to say if we haven't got statistical significance and you're still using this mechanistic approach to teaching, and you get to the end and you're saying, well, we've no longer got that sort of statement that says, is it statistically significant, therefore it implies contextual significance? Students are going to say, well, what is a p-value? Okay, I'm looking through literature, I'm looking through the literature, and there's loads of p-values in the literature. So what does it mean? Okay, you can't offer an amnesty for everything that's been published and say we're going to basically wipe that from sort of, I suppose, the face of the earth. It's going to exist. So students are going to read it and they will want to know what a p-value is. And in particular, the ASA don't ban p-values, but use them sensibly. So I think, you're going to have to start teaching students exactly what a p-value is and actually go into sort of more sort of, I suppose, a bit of the theory, getting them understand the theory, moving away from this real world sort of application and away from statistical thinking a bit. And that's why I've got, get them to think about what's under the bonnet, right? Get them sort of, you're going to have to push them a little bit more. Now, what is also interesting, I think, when I'm teaching my postgraduate students about hypothesis testing, is I will tell them that I think it's okay to do hypothesis testing in RCTs, basically, on confirmatory studies, and then only on my primary outcomes and not the secondary ones. And I think some of them are surprised when I sort of say that, only do it on the primary ones because that's what you powered your study on. And I say, well, I never do it on a pilot trial. And so you've got this sort of exploratory sort of study versus a confirmatory sort of study idea. And I think they find it really surprising that nowadays, I mean, I refuse to do any hypothesis testing on exploratory studies. And only ever do them in confirmatory trials and then on the primary outcomes bit. And I said probably, about sort of 10% of my research involves hypothesis testing now. And I think they find that quite sort of remarkable for a statistician that is very anti-p-values. I'm not anti-p-values, but I'm about using them appropriately. But I will also have a difficult conversation with students about observational studies because I really do feel that p-values are just an artifact of sample size there. And I say I have no idea what they mean. Absolutely zero idea. I'm quite comfortable with using, I suppose, this idea in a RCT of using sort of as contextual significance to drive statistical significance, but have no idea what it means in an observational study. And there we focus very much on accuracy of my sample estimates. Some concluding comments here. I'm sort of, Tom, just letting I'm getting to the end, is sort of, yeah, it's sort of sometimes it's the proof in the pudding, looking at the assessments and sort of thinking sort of how students sort of what they write in their exams. Now, most of my exams are typically 5 marks SAQs, and I'm not going to be able to get many of these ideas that I've been teaching today in a 5-mark SAQ. It's going to be sort of very much sort of hardcore sort of traditional thinking here about what hypothesis testing is about. And therefore, we have this sort of idea that assessment drives learning, not the fact that you get assessed makes you learn. It's basically how you get assessed drives how you learn. And I often think that students basically just skip over a lot of this sort of stuff I present about our current thinking about hypothesis testing, and they're not interested in it. They don't learn it for an exam. And recently this year, just this year, June of this year, I had a scenario in an exam. I always use scenarios from the literature. So I pick like an RCT or an observational study. And this scenario had a statistically significant result. It was a clinical trial. And these are some of the answers I've got. And, a student said, this is a statistically significant result and will probably lead to publication, which makes everyone happy. This is a student writing an exam, hoping to get a mark for that. They're not doing it out of being sort of cynical or a bit flippant. The time is tight. So why would they write that unless they actually believed it? And then there was another student who wrote, there is a less than a 5% probability this is due to random chance. So I'm just sort of banging my head against the wall here, I think. Not all students are like this, but I suspect this student here, the second student, probably learned statistical hypothesis testing in the previous degree, taught in a very mechanistic way, saw my session coming up, thought, what, I don't have to go to Sedgwick session. I know all of it. and I'll be fine for the exam. I can wing it. And they just come out with S. And so therefore they got 0 marks. And they're probably thinking, why have they got 0 marks? I'm just saying, I'm thinking to myself, you should have gone to the teaching. Not all is lost. Student feedback. Some students have said, gosh, this is such a hard thing to teach, but he does break it down. Very complex information, but explained in the best possible way. Now, so that's sort of reassuring. It gives me some sort of feeling that, you know, I should keep carrying on, not just give up now. But what I want to do at the sort of the end here is pick up on the theme of JSM in the summer, which was very much around using stories to inform change. And I was thinking of myself as, you know, as a student, my own personal challenges here. I never understood hypothesis testing. I can't comment on my teachers, and I don't want to, whether they sort of perhaps, you know, were teaching it in a good way or even perhaps a bad way. You know, I turned up for every lecture. That doesn't mean to say I was a good student. Did I engage? But I had personal challenges. I never understood it. And I had massive challenges when I was a junior lecturer trying to sort of understand this, you know, what hypothesis testing was all about, the p-values and everything else. Had some interesting discussions with my sort of, I suppose, my mentor at that time, Martin Bland, who sort of really sort of rammed it home and sort of helped me understand. But, you know, at the same time, I suppose when you're teaching, just remember what it was like to be a student, all right? And to sort of think about some of the challenges that you might have had as a student and use some of those to inform your teaching. And it's like everyone says, you know, to be able to teach, you need to be able to understand it. And I feel as if I am teaching it now because I understand it. But 20, 30 years ago, so 20 years ago, I didn't understand it. And I think I was an awful lecturer because of it. And yet I probably have pushed so many students out into sort of, I suppose, their careers, the research community based on this, what I consider to be bad teaching around the idea that hypothesis testing, this very mechanistic sort of recipe approach where you just collect your data. Have I got statistical significance? Yes, no. And if I have, it's contextually important. And that's, I didn't know how else to describe it at the time. Didn't know what else to say. And my final comment, my final reflections is the significance of significance. And the significance of significance becomes less significant when significance is used 4 times in a sentence. And I'll just leave you on that thought. And Tom, that is the end of my presentation. I hope that we've left enough time for questions.
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes. I was chuckling to myself. I'm sure everyone saw my screen a few times to Philip. I love a lot of the quotes you supplied.
Okay.
There's one I said I want to put on a t-shirt, cynically. That's wonderful. There are 2 questions in the Q&A. I have lots of others, but I want to get to those 2 folks first. So Don and I have the question, you know, what's your opinion on teaching introductory statistics using Bayesian approaches and using Bayes factors instead of p-values?
You see, that's a really sort of interesting question. And I feel that I'm quite embarrassedly going to say, I don't know. You see, I don't know very much about Bayes. Yeah, I do. That's what I'm going to say. But I do, and it was my best module when I was an undergraduate, and I got to score the highest mark, I think, in my year. But I think probably moved into a world where I think journals initially 40 years ago weren't very comfortable with Bayes. And you know, you don't see many articles published in journals nowadays, but that doesn't mean I'm not saying they shouldn't be published. And I just wonder sort of whether the frequentist approach versus Bayes, is it a competition, or is it just more about actually using both to supplement our ideas and thoughts about sort of conducting research?
I would agree with you as well. I use a lot of Bayesian things now, but I don't consider myself a Bayesian. It's just another tool in my toolbox. But I do think it's an interesting problem in my work is that clinicians are not taught Bayesian. They are taught frequentist p-value type approaches. And it leads to a disconnect when I present results. It's a big black box. They're waiting for a p-value and it never comes.
Okay.
Right.
And that must be really hard for them because where's my p-value?
It's tough for both of us.
Yeah. But Tom, can I just say I'm not undermining Bayes in any shape or form. No, I mean, I do very much respect it, but I've been sort of, once you get introduced to sort of, you know, I was sort of introduced to, you get introduced to and told you're now teaching the introductory course or whatever course, the equivalent of 101, and it will be frequentist. You're not going to touch Bayes. And therefore that just what's bred in the bone. And then maybe I should just apologize for that.
Yeah, no, I've been using Bayes methods for 20 years, but I don't know how to teach it, especially at an introductory level. How do you teach Bayesian ideas at a very introductory level? I would love to see that lecture. But I want to get to Anne's question before we have to leave.
Yeah.
She said, you appear to think that teaching statistics, sorry, you appear to think that teaching students statistical thinking is somehow contrary to teaching them what p-values really mean. I see the latter as an essential part of the former. So can you explain why you see this conflict?
I think it's probably sort of this idea of, it's a very, very good point, but it's very much sort of, obviously that's just, I suppose, the way I've approached it, and the idea that statistical thinking is sort of putting everything into a real world and not actually thinking about any of the theory or any of the underlying principles of statistics. And this may be a difference between the teaching that takes place in sort of medical schools in the UK compared to sort of North America. But sort of typically we've 20, 30 years ago, there was a bit more theory in the course, and students hated it. And in particular, there was a massive drive from the GMC to get away from this sort of theoretical approach and getting them to actually be able to learn something that is perhaps more intrinsic and can be used in the real world, I suppose, more readily. And what's the point of learning theory? So if I've given that impression that there's a distinct difference between I suppose, real world thinking, statistical thinking, and learning what p-values is, and I apologize, but in the UK, that really is a very, there is a distinction there, and all of the textbooks that I pick up do not even talk about what, the underlying principles.
And I agree with you. I think teaching p-values is important, but you have to go beyond just getting the p-value.
Yeah, but that is hard for students because they're not experts.
Exactly. And that kind of gets to Michael's question, which I think he's with a like-minded group of individuals. As he said, why is it that no one blinks an eye when, for example, a pharmacologist teaches a statistics course, but the thought of a statistician teaching pharmacology would roundly be considered lunacy?
Yeah, that's really quite interesting. That was Michael, wasn't it? Yeah, so thank you, Michael. I think probably what I think Amy was bringing out in her presentation at Vancouver is that people think it's better to have someone who understands pharmacology, for example, as opposed to a statistician who can understand the statistics, because the pharmacologist will then be able to teach it in context and what it means in their real world. Hence, I suppose that idea of a real world application. But it is sort of, I mean, I would like to sort of scream in my institution, but I just have to live with what happens. I just don't know how to deal with it, but it's a very good point, Michael.
I agree. And as I told you, Philip, I told Philip earlier, my school is redoing our core curriculum as a more of a practical real world based solutions curriculum. And I'm struggling how we're going to teach statistics when everything is real world application. I think this is true. It's going to end up being taught by someone who uses a t-test rather than understands what it's actually doing. Katina had a question here. She said, no question, but a topic. I'll need to read the Moving Beyond paper. I've always felt like we and the introductory textbooks focus too much on procedure. Thank you, and I hope you provide a follow-up to this topic. So that's sort of a
fine.
Nice end there.
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, there is this sort of, and that's a really important point. I think we sort of basically quite often, and even I've done it here, I've sort of said, what I do, but I think there's the next stage and actually helping people think about contextualizing what we're teaching them and putting it into practice. And I have that challenge with confidence intervals as well. But it's, for students, it is sometimes really difficult because they're not the experts in how can we actually get them to make an expert sort of opinion on something that they're not, they don't even understand the subject area.
Correct. Yeah, I'm teaching confidence intervals tonight.
Yeah, okay, good luck.
It's never fun to explain the interpretation of a confidence interval. Before you go, I wanted to ask you a question on a different topic, and it's this issue of what a data scientist is. Since you've thrown out some controversial thoughts, I'm curious what you think about this whole idea of what a data scientist is and where we fit there.
You see, that's really quite interesting. Now, maybe it's laziness on my behalf because I sometimes wonder if myself what a data scientist is, and the RSS, the Royal Statistical Society, now have a sort of I don't know, they have a recognized qualification for data scientists, and I just wonder sort of what it really is. And I've never made sort of much effort to find out myself, but is a data scientist someone, is it just a fancy term? Because statisticians sound quite sort of dry and boring as a profession. And so are we trying to actually make it a little bit more sort of enticing for people to get into that profession? Or is it more about sort of actually simply saying that we can actually sort of accredit people whose, you know, degrees and work are actually more focusing on data, and which doesn't have so much statistics in it? And I'm sure there are, and I know that there are lots of professions where people just look at data and not so much statistics. But it's something that you've got to remember. You know, for me, I was at university 40 years ago, and nowadays things have changed an awful lot, and maybe my thinking hasn't changed with the times.
That's true for a lot of us who are a little younger than you, but still not that far away. So with that, I'm going to call time, because I want to give folks the chance to as well as Philip. He's spending his evening with us, so we really appreciate it. Thanks again to Dr. Sedgwick and all of you for joining us for an excellent discussion that I think our field has going to continue to have for many, many years. I want to thank you, remind you that this webinar will be recorded, has been recorded, and we will post it publicly available on YouTube. Once that process is in place, you will all get an email to watch that again, or tell your friends, your collaborators, your students to watch this. I'm going to do it tonight.
Okay, good.
Now, Philip, you said you had a published manuscript in press that you might want to share with the audience.
Yeah, just very, very quickly. I've actually written some proceedings for the JSM conference that took place in August, based on the talk that I gave then, but it does encompass quite a few of the ideas that we've sort of had here tonight. I don't know when that will be available, and obviously we appreciate that you can only typically, as far as I understand, get access to that if you register for the conference, and that's obviously might be defeating the object of the forum tonight. So once that's available, I presume, Tom, it's okay for me to give it to you. I don't know if I'm breaking any ASA rules by giving it to you and you putting it up on your website.
We will both claim ignorance, and if you want to share it with me, folks, I will send it at the same time I send a link for the YouTube video.
Yeah, definitely. But also I wanted to just simply say, Tom, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for everyone attending tonight. It's been a real pleasure being able to sort of talk to everyone and present.
Wonderful. So thanks again, everybody. That concludes the talk. I'm going to stop. And Philip, it was great to chat with you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's good to chat with you as well, Tom.
Have a great evening, or a great day, everybody.
Yeah, great. Have a good evening. Have a good afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye. I get a little bit confused by the time difference. Thanks, Tom.